Welcome back to the Bible and its Cultural Influence. I'm Seth Pace, and today we will be continuing our discussion of the Holy Week with part 2, from the trial to the crucifixion of Jesus. Now there is a warning with this lecture. Some of the images I'll show during the background to crucifixion are rather graphic, so if there are any children around, I would strongly suggest you make sure they're not privy to seeing those images. And with that, let's get started. We left off at the end of our last lecture with the arrest of Jesus, and the apostles have scattered. We do have Peter following behind Jesus, but for the most part, the apostles have left. And Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin. The reasons that people get so frustrated with the trial of Jesus is there were certain rules that had to be followed with the Sanhedrin. They typically met in this particular area. You see that there are members, roughly 70, and they were made up again of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And if you notice, let me show you, right here, you have the temple right here, you have the general courtyard, and the larger temple complex is of course around this, but they typically met in the raised dome rock area, and that is where they had their sessions. Now, there were rules that had to be followed with the Sanhedrin, and typically they were only to meet in that area I just talked to you about, inside the Temple Mount area. They could only start their sessions between 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, and the reason for this was they believed that evil is done under darkness, and that only in the light of the day can truth be held. You notice there must be 24-hour period elapsed between the conclusion of the testimony and the rendering of the verdict. The Sanhedrin never convened on Sabbaths, religious holidays, and especially never met on Passover. And no meetings again were allowed at night. So, the trial of Jesus that is being done in the courtyard of the high priest breaks all of these rules. There are a series of conversations between Peter and the local people around one of the fires, and 3 times he is asked if he knew Jesus, because people remember seeing him. They talk about the dialect that he speaks is from that particular area of Galilee, and he denies him 3 times. And then of course, when he says it the 3rd time, Jesus looked at him, and he leaves and weeps bitterly. So the Sanhedrin can't kill Jesus. They do not have the power to do this anymore. It's been removed from them because the Romans now control and monitor the area. And nothing is supposed to be done. No one is allowed to kill anybody unless Rome gives the approval. So the chief priests and elders decide to take Jesus to Pilate. So as you can see on the map, they go from the house of Caiaphas all the way up to the fortress, all the way across Jerusalem, to try to get Pilate to basically do their dirty work and kill him. Now while they were moving Jesus, Judas had second thoughts. He regretted what he had done. He goes back to the high priest, throws the 30 pieces of silver back to them, and says that Jesus is innocent and that he wasn't fully aware of what they were going to do to Jesus. Well, the 30 pieces of silver are considered blood money. And since it is blood money, they can't take it back into the temple. So they go out and buy a field, and that particular field is a potter's field, which will be called the field of blood. And it's where thieves and ne'er-do-wells are going to be buried. And Judas is going to go hang himself, and then he eventually will be buried there. And this is referencing back to probably Zechariah chapter 11, which talks about that the 30 pieces of silver are going to be used. Now, the religious authorities, they bring Jesus to Pilate. And Pilate, there have been quite a few scholars who have researched and studied Pilate. There's not a lot we know about him. We do know that he had had some difficulties with the emperor, and so he'd been sent to Jerusalem almost as a punishment. After this event and everything kind of gets back to the emperor about what has happened, then eventually Pilate is going to be sent to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire, and he's going to be put in charge of a small garrison in what is now modern Turkey. And as far as we know, that's where he lives out the rest of his life until he dies. Pilate asks a series of questions to Jesus, and after Jesus answers him and talks to him a little bit, he finds no reason to punish Jesus. Even though the religious authorities are claiming that Jesus says he's a king and that they shouldn't pay taxes to Rome, once Pilate talks to him, he doesn't find that to be the case. Jesus especially stresses to Pilate that his kingship is not of this world. So, from Pilate's perspective, as a Roman governor, Jesus offers no real threat to the government or the status quo, so there's no reason to punish him. Through the questioning, Pilate discovers that Jesus is from Galilee, which actually places him under the jurisdiction of King Herod. So, in order to kind of shoo these Jews away from the garrison, he tells them to take him to King Herod. So they take him over to Herod's palace. Herod was delighted to see Jesus because Herod wanted him to perform miracles for him, wanted him to show off basically the powers that he's heard about through all of Jesus's ministry. Jesus will not respond to Herod. He is completely silent. Herod gets frustrated with this. They end up mocking him, putting on a robe and sending him back to Pilate again. And it is an interesting passage there at the end. It says that Herod and Pilate were enemies before that day, but then they became friends. So they pack Jesus up, put him back in chains, and haul him back up to the governor. Pilate is trying to calm things down. And one of the things he does is he brings out Barabbas. And it's a tradition during the Passover for Pilate to release a prisoner to the crowd. Okay, so he sends Jesus to be flogged and brings him back because he's hoping that once the people see that Jesus has been flogged and scourged, that they will leave him alone. So he brings Jesus out, he brings Barabbas out, and then he asks the people, which do you want me to free? And we assume that Pilate is trying to appeal to their sense, because now they have seen Jesus, who's been beaten and bloody. They see Barabbas, who is a known murderer, and they should be able to pick, why don't you pick the gentle rabbi who just got beat up versus the murderer who purposely tried to kill and will probably kill again. And one of the other things to consider is it says in Scripture that Pilate knew that the religious authorities, the Jewish priests, were jealous of him and jealous of the Roman rule and wanted to cause problems to hopefully get rid of him. We also know that Pilate's wife had had a dream that told her Jesus was innocent, and she pleaded with Pilate to please let Jesus go. So Pilate has Jesus flogged. They dress him in a purple robe. They put a crown of thorns on his head and shove them down onto his head. They even give him a reed in his right hand, and the soldiers mock him and spit on him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and strike him. Now, what's often overlooked right here is the soldiers are actually playing a game with Jesus. This was called the King's Game. And we know from several Roman garrisons in the Middle East that this was done, especially to prisoners who are whipped. So in the open courtyards of the garrisons, archaeologists have discovered that there are stones, paving stones put in the ground that form a large circle. And on these stones are engraved at certain points a punishment and a number. And what the Roman soldiers would do is, after they beat the prisoners or flogged them, in some cases almost to death, like in the case with Jesus, they would stand them up as a mock king on this playing board. They would roll dice and determine how many spaces you would move, and wherever you stopped on that particular tile, whatever punishment was engraved on the tile was the punish they would do to you, which could be anything from spitting on you, striking you, hitting you with rods, or even probably whipping you again. So that's what's going on when they're probably doing "Hail the King of the Jews." And it says the soldiers are striking him and spitting on him. And he takes him back in to ask him more questions. He does ask Jesus an interesting question at this point. Pilate asks him, "Do you know that I have the power to let you go, to kill you or let you go?" And Jesus responds that it's only from the power given to him from above. So the Jews say to Pilate that he is no friend of Caesar if he releases Jesus, because Jesus is claiming to be king. Pilate takes Jesus to what is called the pavement. And this was a stone platform or a raised platform where the governor would sit in a chair with the guilty people around him who are on trial. And this was the official judgment place. So all of this conversation that's been going on before, Pilate was simply trying to convince them to let Jesus go. But whenever he went out and sat on the raised platform, the pavement, then the Jews knew that he was about to pronounce punishment. Pilate is going to wash his hands. It says he takes water and washes his hands. He says he is innocent of Jesus' blood. And the Jewish leaders say that Jesus' blood will be on them and their children. And so from that, Pilate he releases Barabbas and pronounces Jesus to be crucified. And as I've talked about in class before, this passage about the Jewish leaders saying, "Let Jesus' blood be on our heads and on our hands," that this may be the beginning of anti-Semitic feelings that we see that grow, especially in the Middle East and in Europe. Because as we go along and get into the Middle Ages, you'll find that a lot of people are starting to get frustrated with the Jews who were scattered after the destruction of the temple in 70. And as they grow in power, especially in the financial areas, then you'll have phrases starting to be used against Jews where Protestants will call them Christ killer, and the hatred and bigotry toward them starts to grow immensely. And you see this even when you read things like Ben Jonson, or William Shakespeare. The Merchant of Venice The hatred they feel towards Shylock and Tybalt is staggering. How much they call him names and wish he were dead. So with the punishment, Jesus is to be crucified. And they're going to take him from the garrison area out to Golgotha, or Golgotha. And this is the traditional spot of crucifixion, which we'll go into a little bit more detail. Jesus is going to walk the road to the crucifixion. And we'll talk a little bit later about the Stations of the Cross and what that means. But as they go out and they start up the hill to where they're going to crucify him, the soldiers are going to offer Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, and he refused to drink it. This was a common drink given to men who are about to be crucified. And the myrrh mixed with wine has a numbing, mildly hallucinogenic property, so it was supposed to calm you down whenever they get ready to actually nail you up on the cross. Jesus refuses it, and which kind of stuns the soldiers because they've done this a lot. This is not their first time. And that brings us to our discussion on the background of the crucifix and crucifixion. So, I'm going to pause here for a few moments and make sure everybody's ready for this. So the majority of the medical information that I've pulled for this part of the lecture on crucifixion actually comes from this article on the physical death of Jesus Christ by Dr. Edwards, and you can look this up if you'd like. It's in the Journal of the American Medical Association back in 19. The article does a great job of explaining what actually happens to the body with the illustrations, which I've pulled from the article to show y'all coming up. So crucifixion, let's talk about the history of it first of all. Crucifixion began, as far as we know, with the Persians. And what the Persians would do is they would impale you. It could be done with something short, like a 6 or an 8 foot pole, or it can be done with a pole up to 20 feet long. And basically they would just stick it into your gut, lift you up into the air, and then drop the end of the pole into a hole. And you were impaled and sitting up in the air. Of course, you would try to stop yourself from sliding down the pole, but eventually you're going to become exhausted from the pain and the stress and the difficulty breathing, and you're going to let go, slide down the pole, and die. That was bad enough. But of course, the Roman Empire was always looking for new ways to modify and take techniques that they liked and turn them into their own. And crucifixion is a really disturbing apex of their torture devices. Crucifixion is a very bloodless death if you are just crucified. And the Romans had a series of techniques that they would use depending on how much they wanted you to suffer. You could die within a matter of just a few hours, or you could live for days. According to the historians, Spartacus, the gladiator who led the rebellion against Rome, survived for up to 7 days on the cross before he died. That was, of course, after he watched all 300 of the men, I believe it was 300, of his men who followed him. They were crucified in front of him first. But let's look at some details. Crucifixion, you don't necessarily have to be nailed to the cross. There are some techniques of crucifixion where you were simply tied to the cross. And you're left there until you die. And the way you died, like I said, since you're not cutting open for the most part any large areas of the body to bleed, because most people were not whipped before they were crucified. Usually it was one or the other, not both. And the nails go through points in the human body that actually don't bleed that much. So the way you die is asphyxiation. You can no longer breathe. You can't expel the carbon dioxide, and you suffocate. So you see, it comes from the Latin crucifixio, meaning fixing to a cross, or to fix or bind fast. It was used from 6th century BC by the Romans mainly, all the way up till Emperor Constantine comes in. He, of course, is going to abolish it whenever he makes Christianity the official religion. And it was used to terrorize people. You would take your criminals, you would crucify them and either put them up on a hill so that you could see them as you were going into the city, like in the case of Jerusalem, or you would line the crosses up down the road so people would have to walk by them. Now, in the case of Jesus, he is scourged before he's made to carry the cross. And this was a technique that the Romans would use. It can be anything from a small whip with lead balls on the end of it, all the way to a whip with fish hooks and pieces of metal in it. We're not sure which they used on Jesus, but they typically would lash you not only across the back, but across the thighs, across the calves. And the whipping or scourging scene in the Passion of the Christ is especially bloody. As far as types of crosses, there are actually a huge variety of crosses the Romans would use. But the basic types was the crux simplex, which was either a pole or a sapling tree that they would nail you to, which this was probably the early variation from the impaling. This transitioned into what we call the crucifix. And of course, if they used the sapling tree, one of the things that made it particularly ugly was that it would move in the wind still. Then we had the basic T, the cross that looks like an X, and then the classic cross that probably we'll talk more in detail in a second about those. But here are some variations. Yeah, the low and tall cross. Now, in a lot of Renaissance painting especially, you'll see Jesus up on a very tall cross. And there's a reason for that, because they want you to be looking up, similar to whenever you go into cathedrals or your large liturgical churches. The whole point is to draw your eyes up to the grandeur of God and the immensity of the universe. And so Jesus is often put up as a transition high in the air between heaven and earth. Actually, his cross probably was not like this. And it's probably a lot lower to the ground. This one actually is probably pretty high up in the air. You see variations. You see the X version over here, right on this one, and the two thieves on the side. So as you see, they can't sit because the way the poles are set up on the large X cross, you're constantly sliding down one way or the other. As you see up here with the large red arrow, there's a piece of wood in front of Jesus's wrist. And we'll talk more about that later, because a lot of people are misguided when we're talking about the cross, because when it says that the nails were put into his hands and feet, we tend to think it looks something like this. And a lot of times on crucifixes, you'll see cases like this of the very emaciated Jesus with the nails in the palms, as you see right here. And that's not where they would nail you if they're going to nail you to the cross. The reason for that is, to put it brutally honestly, that it will pull out. And there are other places to put the nails that would hold the body better, which is probably through the wrist, between the radia and ulna bone. So, the cross, as you see down here with the two crosses, there's one, and they're both low crosses. These crosses typically were only about 6 feet, 7 feet tall. If the stipes, which is the pole, this section right here that's in the ground that you see, this is the stipe. And then we have the cross beam that is lashed on his back right over here. If the stipe is only about 6 foot tall, 7 foot tall, that actually makes more sense. Because remember that the Roman legionnaires who do the crucifixion, this is what they do. This is their job. They are very good at this. They can crucify hundreds of people in a couple of days. If you have the stipe only 6 foot off the ground at the top, then it's very easy for Roman soldiers to grab the crossbeam, lift it up, and set it on top of the stipe. I mean, you would be off the ground only by a couple of feet. Now, the difference in that, when you think about it, is when Jesus is put on the cross, he's stripped. And we see him oftentimes in pictures like this with a loincloth, but probably he wasn't. He was probably completely naked, bloody, and they hang you on the cross right there. Right? Just a foot or two above your head is where his head would be. This is a much more personal death. He's not up high. He's right there in front of you as he's dying. Now, the crossbeam weighed anywhere from 75 to 100 pounds. It is not, none of the crucifixes are finished woodwork. They're used over and over and over again. They don't have to be smooth and beautiful looking because you're about to crucify a criminal on it. They typically use these over and over again. So when you hear about people looking for the cross of Jesus or the nails on the cross of Jesus that held him in place, those were reused. The Roman soldiers were incredibly efficient at what they did. They're not going to put somebody on a cross and when he dies, burn the cross or bury the cross. No, they're going to reuse it again and again. So these crosses and the stipes that were in the ground are honestly probably covered in blood and other bodily fluids. You see over here in the tablet, Pilate does make a tablet that normally whenever someone is taken out to be crucified, there would be a sign that the Roman soldier would carry in the front as he's walking to the crucifixion site. And on that sign would be the crime that the person had committed. But Jesus' sign said, Jesus, King of the Jews. And they actually post that on top of the cross, as you see right here, depending on what type of cross it is as to where they might have posted that. And remember, the body is going to hang down, so even on this short, the T cross or the towel cross, you're still going to be able to see it. The Jewish leaders asked Pilate to take it down, and Pilate said no. That's probably Pilate's retaliation for this whole issue. But they finally get to the site of crucifixion, and they're going to nail Jesus. All right. How they did it. They typically, like I said, did not put it through the hand because the hand could not support the weight of the body. So they'd put it through the wrist. This was a whole lot worse because we're talking about a nail that's around 7 inches long, and it would have been put through the nerve cluster, right where the nerve center runs. similar to where your carpal tunnel is. All those nerves that come down your forearm and then spread out across the palm of your hand, they go into that center point, and that's where you put this nail. So every time it's going to cause the hand to clench up into a claw. In order to breathe, you're going to have to push up and pull on that nail, which means that metal in your wrist is on the nerve endings. In the feet, there were a couple of different ways that they could do this. And again, depending on how much they wanted you to suffer. They could drive it between the bones right here in the foot, on the top of the foot. They could also put it through the side of the foot. The little step that we see oftentimes, that could be added if they wanted to make it last longer. They could do that for you. So the body ends up in a position like this. It twists the torso, which makes breathing even harder. The only way that you can breathe is if you pull down on the hands and push up with the feet in order to lift your rib cage high enough in order to breathe in. Eventually you become exhausted from that, and like I said, you're going to die of asphyxiation. There was another variation that we've seen, which is like this, where they would, instead of using a step or through the top of the foot, they would drive it through the ankles. If they wanted it to last a long time, they would tie you, as you see in this drawing right here. They would tie you with rope and not nail you, or they can nail your hands on the back side of the cross. It is considered by many doctors to be the absolute worst torture ever devised by mankind. In artwork, this is Dali over here on the left. You have Dali's painting right here, which is just an amazing work of art if you ever get to see it. Because if you notice back here in the back, the sun is coming up. And if you notice, what he's crucified on is not a cross. It's actually a hypercube, which is a three-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional cube. And it's amazing to me that Dali actually used this image, because it's showing a higher dimensional quality of what he's being crucified on. These are the paintings that you see a lot of. Like I said, usually Jesus is very clean. There's not a lot of blood. He's clothed. You see the crucifixion image in a lot of movies. In Cool Hand Luke, which is an amazing film if you've never seen it, he has a scene where, in order to unify all the prisoners, because they divided into two groups and they're fighting, they have a challenge of eating hard-boiled eggs. And Luke is able to eat them, and in the process of eating the eggs, it unifies. Everybody starts cheering for him and rooting for him to be able to do the challenge, and he does. And they're all carried away with their camaraderie, and they all leave, and they leave him on the dining room table, and he falls into a crucifix, which is just beautiful, because he's shown his willingness to sacrifice himself to bring them together. And in this case, there were stories in World War I about British soldiers and American soldiers being crucified by Germans on barn doors using bayonets, which of course stirred up our feelings of nationalism and want us to go to war. Here you see some modern comics, and this one says unemployment at the top. Now, after Jesus is crucified, the soldiers, it said, divided his clothes into 4 parts, and they came to his tunic, and it said that his tunic did not have any seams. And so they cast lots, which also fulfills a prophecy in order to determine who's going to get his tunic. And some have just blown past this and not paid attention to it. But if you ever get a chance to read The Robe, the book by, I believe, Douglas, it goes into detail about the soldier who ends up with the tunic, and he goes to find out who this person was. It's interesting, though, to note that it says it has no seam. There was a particular area in the Holy Lands that made tunics or outer cloaks that had no seam. And they were very special, and they were a little more expensive than most. So chances are that this was probably a gift given to Jesus, and the soldiers recognized that it was worth something, so they didn't just tear it into 4 parts, or they actually cast lots. Jesus is going to pray, Father, forgive them. They know not what they're doing. And there's going to come a time a little bit later when Jesus is actually going to take in a breath and quote the beginning of the 22nd Psalm, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, some have wondered, why is that what Jesus says? Well, again, he's a rabbi. And the very fact that in this incredible, mind-boggling level of pain and suffering he's in, one of the things that he's able to take a breath and utter, to use his breath on, is to quote Scripture. And if you go back and read Psalm 22, you find out that that's when David was in a very difficult place. He thought God had abandoned him. But when you get to the end of the psalm, you find out that God hasn't. So remember, the Jews, whenever you start to quote a scripture like that, they would know the rest of the psalm. So they would know what Jesus is trying to say. It's kind of lost on a lot of Protestants whenever we look at that. Of course, as you see, the leaders wanted the sign taken down that said Jesus of Nazareth, King of Jews. And Pilate said, no, he's not going to do it. I've had enough of you people. Okay. And then we're going to have the discussion of Jesus and the 2 thieves. There are 2 criminals who are also crucified on each side of Jesus. One is called the penitent criminal, and the other is the impenitent criminal. And what this means is the one who criticizes Jesus, who constantly lashes out at him, he traditionally is given the name of Gestas, and we're not sure why he is being punished. Sometimes in artwork you will see a cup, a golden cup, hanging on his cross. And sometimes in history, in the Roman tradition, not only would they carry a sign with your crime, but occasionally you would have the symbol of your crime tied around your neck or hung on the crucifix. So, not really sure what his crime is, and I've never been able to find anybody who could tell me exactly what the gold cup means. Some assume that it is the Grail, the Holy Grail, and we'll talk a little bit about that in our next lecture, the difference between the cup used during the Last Supper versus the Grail, which is, it's not the same thing. And then you had the other thief on the other side. And then the penitent thief is usually given the name of Dismas. And some have actually claim that he is the first saint. And depending on artwork and what you see, sometimes you will see a small bag tied around his neck, which most scholars think that he was a thief, and so that's supposed to represent stolen money. Jesus looks down and sees John and his mother Mary and Mary Magdalene. And he tells John to look after his mother. And according to church tradition, he does. And even though John has a very difficult time at the end of his life, he takes Mary, according to tradition, into Asia Minor, and she dies in Asia Minor. And then John, of course, eventually will be boiled alive and survive, and then put on Patmos and survive. And then he gets out and goes to Asia Minor and dies in that same area of churches. But John is given responsibility for Mary, Jesus' mother, and he takes it, which is an incredible act. 3 o'clock rolls around, and we see from noon to 3 the whole land becomes dark. Okay. Then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which I talked to you is taken from the 22nd Psalm. Then Jesus calls out, "Into your hands I commit my spirit, Father," and he breathes his last. And this is, like I said, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is also the traditional time that you sacrifice the sacrificial lamb in the temple. After Jesus died, says the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And we're talking about the area that's separated. Remember, in the temple, you have out here, which is the holy place, and then in here you have the most holy place, which is where the Ark of the Covenant was, and the curtain separated. This is where the seat of God was, and then the only person who could go behind the curtain was the high priest once a year. The curtain was 30 feet tall, incredibly thick. There have been estimates anywhere from 2 inches thick to 8 inches thick, but it was thick. There were 2 curtains actually overlapped, so you could never accidentally see into the Holy of Holies. And this curtain was ripped from the top to the bottom, indicating it no one started it on the bottom. It was done supernaturally. Then you also notice there was earthquakes, and then tombs were opened and many saints raised from the dead. If you look in Matthew 27, verse 51, at that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks split. The tombs broke open, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many people. I just find that passage amazing. And whenever I point it out to students, they're always just kind of shocked because they've never really paid attention to it. So the legionnaires are going to break the legs of those crucified, and this helps speed up the process of asphyxiation because you can no longer lift up. They break the legs of the 2 thieves. They get to Jesus, though, and he's already dead, which is quite surprising to them because he's only been up there for a few hours. So they pierce his side with a lance, and it says blood mixed with water come out of the wound in Jesus' side. Yeah, so this is, of course, one of the wounds of Christ. The lance is actually considered a holy artifact, and the legionnaire is going to earn the name from this as Saint Longulas, or the Saint of the Lance. And when he stabs Jesus between the ribs up into the heart, which was a typical way for them to check to see if you were dead. And they pull the lance out. It says that water and blood comes out. So there's been a separation. Doctors say that probably what has happened is the pressure and buildup on the strain on the heart of Jesus. The sac around the heart has filled with fluid. So his heart has stopped beating because of the pressure of the fluid around his heart. So if you want to be more poetic about it, you could say literally Jesus died because his heart stopped, because his heart broke. So Joseph, we said, of Arimathea, goes to Pilate and says, we got to get his body off the cross. Please let us have him, because the Passover is about to start. The centurions verify that Jesus is dead. And remember, these guys, this is what they do. They are a squad of legionnaires who crucify people. They know when someone's dead. They took his body down. It says that Nicodemus brought 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe to prepare the body. That was very common. We'll talk more about that when we get to the discussion about the Shroud of Turin. So they take his body down, but they're not able to properly prepare the body because they don't have enough time. So they lay out the linen, place his body on it, cover it, and then roll the stone into place. And then they have to go get ready for the Sabbath. So the burial sites, here we go, in the ancient world, typically they're carved out of stone, and you would use one burial site for your entire family. So you would lay the body of the person who died out here on the ledge. Then once you had finally prepared the body, packed the aloe, the myrrh, all the flowers, everything you're going to in the body, and wrapped it up, then you would slide the body into one of these alcoves. You would wait a certain amount of time, a certain amount of years. Remember, it is a dry desert area. You go back eventually, you would unwrap the body, you would collect the bones, and you would put the bones into a bone box, and then set the bone box over on the side. That would free up more area for your family. Well, it says that this was a brand new tomb carved out. No one was in it. They placed him in it, and then this large stone, which was another typical thing right here, would roll down this slot. As you see, it's angled into place, and then it would stop people from getting in there. And so it's like here, and then of course the Roman centurions are going to put a wax seal across the top of it with a cord that shows that no one is going to break into it. The guards that are watching the tomb are legionnaires. Legionnaires had one rule when they were guarding something. If they fall asleep, then the next morning at sunrise, the legionnaires who had fallen asleep would be taken by the centurion. They would be tied to a pole, all of their belongings thrown at their feet, and not only they would be burned alive, but everybody who was part of their guard would be burned with them. They did not fall asleep. Now, what Jesus does during the Sabbath, there is a passage later on we find that talks about that Jesus went to talk to those who had lived in the days of Noah and had offered them salvation. That's a point we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to our discussion of heaven and hell. Resurrection Sunday rolls around. Sabbath is over. And so Mary and they're going to go take care of the body because they weren't able to properly prepare Jesus for burial. They're going to go back and get ready to do it now. And they're going to find that the stone has been rolled back. There's an angel sitting there. And he's wanting to know, what are y'all looking for? Okay. It says that they peer in, and there's an angel at the foot and an angel at the head of the burial cloth, where the burial cloth was, and that the cloth that covered Jesus' head is folded up, which we'll talk about what that means a little bit later. The women go to tell the disciples. Peter and John run to the tomb, and of course John beats him because John's young and like a teenager. And then we begin this series of what are called the appearances, where Jesus appears to the apostles. He appears to the gentleman walking on the road to Emmaus. There are some really interesting stories that we'll look at about that later. Whenever we get to the appearances and then the Shroud of Turin and the weapons of Christ, which will be our next lecture. There are several really interesting movie versions of the Passion of Jesus. Of course, the one that everybody talks about is the one directed by Mel Gibson a few years ago, which is very good, but it is incredibly bloody and violent. So if you watch it, I think they're accurate on a few things. Of course, it is coming from a liturgical and Catholic background, so they do cover the Stations of the Cross. And I actually have a lecture that if you watch this movie, we go through the lecture and I point out and all the Stations of the Cross and who Saint Veronica is and what's going on with these different situations. Why, whenever they flip the cross over to nail Jesus to it, why doesn't the cross touch the ground? Why does Jesus' body never touch the ground? And all those come from Catholic traditions and stories, which I talk about a little bit later. But that wraps up a lengthy discussion on the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. Our next lecture will be over, like I said, the appearances, the Shroud of Turin, and what are called the weapons of Christ. So I hope you all have a peaceful day, and shalom.